you and the members of the Australian Constitutional Monarchy for the invitation to not only be here today, but also to be able to address you on the occasion of us marking and celebrating the birthday of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth. David asked me if I would speak to you today on some reflections of my time in the Parliament over the last 13 years, and also to make some comments about both our constitutional arrangements and the Australian flag, and I'm very happy to do both. Just before I stood to speak to you, David said, Brendan, do you mind beginning your speech whilst people are continuing to eat? So I'll begin with one reflection, and that is that in 2002, shortly after I'd been appointed Minister for Education, Science and Training, I had been asked to deliver the Chapman oration to the Institution of Engineers of Australia at a dinner format at the Park Hyatt in Melbourne to some 600 engineers and their families. And if you are one or have them in your family, you'll know they're a pretty serious lot. And so I dutifully did what I was required to do, and I delivered a 45-minute oration. And when I sat down, the then Chief Executive leaned over and said, Dr. Nelson, I do apologise for beginning to eat whilst you were starting your speech, but your wife assured me I should enjoy something while you were talking. So that's why I say that to you. Please continue to eat, because my wife would certainly say I might well enjoy something for the next 20 minutes. In terms of my reflections, firstly on, shall I say, a more humorous note, when I first came to Bradfield in 1995, the biggest issue, David, was not my former affiliation given to me by my father with the Australian Labor Party. There was a much, much bigger issue, and that was the fact that I had a diamond earring. And I'd had an earring for some 20 years. When I was 17, my then girlfriend had said it would be a good idea if I had one, and I thought, well, if that's what it takes, I should get one. And so I arrived in Bradfield, which is on Sydney's Upper North Shore, and there are some of the people in this room who actually were instrumental in me finally winning pre-selection, which was not an easy process. And I recall we had a 2-hour campaign meeting prior to the 1996 election, and almost all of that time was spent debating whether the candidate's brochure would show my ear with the earring or the ear without the earring. So I understand this is what leadership is all about, and in the end I said, right, that's it, I've had enough, we're going with the earring. So we sent the brochure out to all of the households in Bradfield, and for those of you who are familiar with any political campaigning, you'll know this is an extraordinary result. We had 800 returned. These were people that had to put them in an envelope, buy a stamp, address the envelope, put it in the mail and send it back. And the brochures came back with some fancy things written on them. In some cases, a circle around the ear. In some cases, the ear had been cut out. I then, during the campaign, were receiving 6 or 7 phone calls a day. I'm not voting for a bloke with an earring, they hang up. A woman rang to say, my 17-year-old daughter told me to tell you, Dr. Nelson, you're out of date. You've only got one earring and it's in your ear. I then had the extraordinary situation some 3 days before polling day in 1996 of receiving a delegation of ladies of the electorate, stern, very well dressed. Not one wanted a cup of tea, which is a very concerning sign. And the appointed spokesperson said, Dr. Nelson, we will come straight to the point. We believe you are a homosexual. You have an earring. I said, yes. She said, as far as we're concerned, you're a person most unsuited to represent us in this community. And I struggled with my thoughts, and I said, well, I can assure you, most certainly, that I am not a homosexual. And at which point this lady leaned across the table and banged her fist down and said, yes, but can you prove it? And fortunately, a member of the delegation saw some humour in that, which diffused the situation. Consistent also with David's introduction, I worked very hard in my first term in Parliament, from 1996 to 1998. So I'm standing at the Pymble train station during the election campaign in 1998, and I'm handing out what my wife unkindly calls propaganda. I call it useful information. And a lady said to me, "Oh, Dr. Nelson, you are the best member we have ever had here. You are doing a superb job." And you don't get a lot of that, and I thought, well, this is good. And she said, "We have 5 voters in my household, but not one of us can vote for you." She said, "We're all the other way. We're all Liberals." So I realised that I still had just a little bit of work to do in repositioning my persona in the electorate. And similarly, it was during that campaign that 3 weeks after election day, I had 300 people crammed into the Turramurray Martin Church Hall. And I'm 2 minutes into explaining to them all why a GST would be good for Australia. And there's a fellow jammed like a sardine against the back wall, and he's gesticulating with his arms and so on, and he's yelling out, he said, "I can't hear." And a woman stood up the second row and said, "I can, and I'm happy to swap with you." I then had an experience, which I'll just pass on to you before I speak of more serious matters. And it was 1997, and I'm one of those people that started with a safe seat and campaigned tirelessly to make it marginal. So, I was having one of those days, and I've got the electorate correspondence, and I get to this, and there's a fellow who's complaining, and he'd gone into a shop in Chatswood to get change for a parking meter, and the shop owner wouldn't give him any change unless he bought something in the shop. So outraged by this, he did what we'd all do. He immediately wrote to his federal member about this. So I wrote to him, and it wasn't Mr. Stone, but dear Mr. Smith, shall I say, thank you for your letter of no date in regard to your anger and disappointment at your local shop for failing to give you change without making a purchase. Each day in my office I deal with horrific stories of man's inhumanity to man, including extraordinary anecdotes relating to many things, such as child abuse, murder, suicide, families split asunder by inadequate compassion and warped views of justice, the taking by the state of various bodily parts of deceased individuals for research, homeless children, environmental degradation, decent hard-working men thrown in a scrap heap because they're too old, penury, perjury, prostitution, ignorance, irrationality, intrigue, the legacy of landmines of developing nations, foreign aid, treason and trollopy, constitution, the crown, the frail, the insane,